So September 26th, it's Tuesday, and this is our 1 o'clock Eastern Time live meeting on Aesop's Fables. We'll give a few more minutes for students to settle in, and then we'll get going here. Can you give me a wave if you can hear me okay? Just wave your hand if you can hear me. Okay, good, thank you. So a few more minutes, we've still got students showing up, still early. So again, this is for students who are working in Aesop's Fables. Today, we're actually going to read and discuss two different fables. And what my goal is for these lessons, for these meetings, is that you get some help understanding the fable so that you can turn around as soon as this meeting is over and you can go submit those assignments for these fables. So if you can, grab a piece of paper and a pen, and you can maybe jot down some of the ideas so you can remember what you'd like to write on your assignments. You can also watch the recording of this video later if you don't want to take notes. You just want to watch and relax, that's okay. But we're going to discuss two fables today because the first one is pretty short and simple, and then the second one is a little bit longer. So we'll try to get through two today. So you could turn around and submit two assignments pretty quickly. That's really the best way to do it. All right, so we'll give a couple more minutes because students are still coming in. So if you're new to these meetings, I keep student audio or student microphones turned off during the meeting, just so there's no distractions. But you can text any questions you have in the chat. It's okay to say hello and chat to one another before we get started. But once we get started, I'd like you to not be chatting unless you have a question or something like that. So let's keep the chat quiet. And then at the end of the meeting, when I get finished going over everything that I'd like to talk about, then we can stay on and you can ask any questions, and I'll stay with you as long as you still need help. So so if you have a question or there's something you'd like to talk about, just hang around until the end, and then we can let the students go who don't have questions, and we can talk as much as you'd like to. Okay. All right, it's 1:03, so I'm going to get started here. As I said, this live class is for students who are in Aesop's Fables or studying Aesop's Fables in the Academy. It's intended for students of all ages. It doesn't matter what lesson you're on. It doesn't matter whether you're just getting started or you've been studying Aesop for a year or two now. We're going to go over the fables together during these meetings, and I'll help you to learn how to study these fables, how to figure out the moral lesson of the fables. We can chat about it a little bit. Note that in these fables, when we get into these questions, about the moral lessons of the fables and how they apply and things like that, there's no real right or wrong answer. So when you study it, I'd like you to think about it on your own. Sometimes I might give maybe the most common answer or something like that. But there's a lot more to these fables than just one right answer. So you can think about these when you're 10 years old or when you're 50 years old, and you'll see different things in the fables, think about different meanings and uses. So as you study them, if you get an idea of what it might mean or how it might apply, and it's not the same thing that you've heard me say, it doesn't mean you're wrong. And I'd like you to feel free to share that, because there's a lot to these fables, a lot more than most people think. The first fable we're going to study today, this is lesson 96 in the Aesop's Fables course. So if you want to get the assignment done, it's going to be lesson 96, and I'm going to share my screen here with you so we can read it together. We'll take a look at this. This is the fable of the geese and the cranes, and give me a quick wave of your hand if you can see that. Okay, can you see that all right? Can you read that? Good. I know some of you are sitting together in like a group. Maybe it might be hard to read, but hopefully that's big enough for everybody to read. So we're going to study the fable of the geese and the cranes. And for each lesson, there's a number of questions that we want to answer, right? The first thing you have to do is give the name of the fable. So the name of this fable is the geese and the cranes. And you may not know what geese and cranes even are. So you may need to take some time to figure that out. But what I recommend is you just read the fable, and sometimes the story will explain to you what these different characters are. So before you start using dictionaries or anything like that, just read the fable first, because it might make it plain. It might not even be that important. So don't go crazy trying to figure out what things are. The second thing you need to do in these lessons is you need to write a paraphrase, which is a short summary of the fable that proves that you read it carefully, and you should do that using your own words. So you should tell the story of the fable as if someone asked you, hey, what is that fable about? And you just told them what the fable's about in your own words. That's a paraphrase, okay? But then the questions get a little more difficult. You're asked, what is the moral lesson of this fable? And sometimes that can be hard to figure out. In fact, this lesson here, the geese and the cranes, many students struggle with this fable because it's a little difficult to figure out what the moral lesson is. Then after you figure out the moral lesson, think about that, you're asked to explain why Aesop chose these characters. Why did he choose to tell this story with geese and cranes? So you've got to think about the characters and why Aesop chose them. And then lastly, you've got to answer a question about how this fable, how this lesson can apply to your life. How can you use this fable in your life? So those are the questions that we seek to answer for every one of Aesop's fables, and I'll try to help you think about those answers. But remember, just because I go through certain answers with you, that doesn't mean that's the only possible answer. You might read the fable and have some thoughts of your own, and that's good. One thing I tell students all the time is that when you read these fables, there's usually a number of different characters, and you can think about the meaning of the fable from the eyes of the different characters. So you might want to read this fable and think about it from the eyes of the geese. You know, what do the geese think in this fable? Then you might want to think about it from the perspective of the cranes and think, what do the cranes think about this fable? And then we're going to read about a farmer in this fable, and you might want to think, what does the farmer think in this fable? So you might be able to put yourself in the shoes of the different characters and think about the story, and that might help you to see different moral lessons, to think about it in different ways. So there's lots to think about with these fables, and just because I share one explanation or one moral lesson, that doesn't mean it's the only one. And if you feel like you've got some other thoughts, feel free to share them when you do your assignments, okay? So let's look together now at the geese and the cranes, okay? I'll read it, and then we'll look at it. So be ready to answer some questions in the text chat if I ask. The fable of the geese and the cranes. A party of geese and a party of cranes were discovered by the farmer eating his young corn, which was then just appearing above the ground. The cranes, being light of wing, flew off, and all the weight of the punishment fell on the geese. Okay, so this is the fable of the geese and the cranes. Now, I want to ask you a question here. Based on what we read, do you know what geese are? What are geese? Let's just talk about the characters first. What are geese? Give me a quick little description of geese. What are geese? They're birds. That's good. Okay, they are birds. Are they small birds like, like a cardinal or a blue jay, or are they big birds like a duck? What kind of birds are there? They're bigger birds, right? They're big birds. Not like little tree birds. They're more like birds that we'd see at a lake or a pond. Bigger birds, good. Bigger than ducks, very good. Okay, so those are geese. You've probably seen geese because geese are pretty common. You might see geese at a park where there's a pond or something like that. How about cranes? What are cranes? Anybody know what a crane is? What are cranes? Not so many answer for cranes. Cranes are another kind of bird. What do we learn about the cranes in the fable? This is why I say you don't necessarily need to look them up. What do we learn about cranes in the fable? How are cranes different from geese? Rebecca says tall, skinny birds. What does the fable tell us about the difference between cranes and geese? See who's paying attention. You can read it on the screen. What do we learn about cranes? How are they different from geese? Well, geese can fly too. Geese can fly. Okay, Rebecca wrote and Margaret wrote, cranes are light, right? Cranes are light of wing. Cranes are lightweight. That's a good answer. Okay, so we know that there's a difference between them. And this is why I say it's not that big of a deal that you understand, the whole history of these animals. There's one important difference between cranes and geese, and it's that cranes are light of wing. That means they can fly away easily, whereas geese are bigger, heavier animals that are slower to fly away. Okay, so all right, so that's all for the chat. Let's get back to this fable now. So we've got a party of geese and a party of cranes. Party means just a group, like a flock. So we've got these two groups of birds, and they're eating young corn plants. So the farmer planted his corn, and after some time, the corn sprouted, and now it's starting to grow. So there's these young corn plants starting to grow, and the geese and the cranes see these corn plants growing up, and they decide, oh man, that looks yummy. Let's go get some of that young corn. So they start eating the farmer's corn. The farmer looks out into his field and sees all the birds eating his new plants. And so what do you think he did? Tell me in the chat. What do you think the farmer did when he saw the birds out in his cornfield? You think he took a picture? He probably grabbed the gun. Yeah, he probably grabbed the gun or let the dog out the back door or ran out into the backyard and yelled at them, right? Trying to scare them away. Good. Okay. So the farmer runs out. He doesn't want those birds eating his corn. So he runs out and chases them away, but we're going to assume that he did more than chase them away. He probably ran out with a gun, or maybe he let some dogs out or something like that. So the cranes and the geese are both doing the same thing. They're both eating this corn, but the cranes have an advantage. The cranes are lighter than the geese, and so as soon as the farmer shows up and the birds see the trouble, the cranes are able to take off and get out of there. But the geese are heavier and they get stuck behind, and we read all the weight of the punishment fell on the geese. Okay, so we have this fable of the geese and the crane. So now we've got to ask the question, and I'm not asking, I'm going to tell you the answer to this question, at least to get started. We've got to ask, what is the moral lesson of this fable? Well, when you get to the moral lesson, what I want you to think about is, I want you to think about all of the details that you read in the fable, because the moral lesson is usually revealed by the details. Okay, now, if we think about birds, if we think about geese and cranes, they're not doing anything wrong by eating some corn growing in a field. It's not like the birds understand that, this plant is okay to eat, but that plant is not okay to eat. They're just doing what they do by nature. They're just looking for some plants to eat. And if one happens to taste better to them than another, that's the one that they're going to choose. And farmers know that when they plant crops, they know that they're going to attract animals. They're going to attract all kinds of animals. So the geese and the cranes aren't necessarily doing anything wrong, but the farmer is trying to grow a crop, and he doesn't want the birds eating this one kind of plant. After all, there are 1,000 different plants that these birds can go eat. They don't need to eat his corn, and so he's going to try to chase them away from eating his corn. The two different kinds of birds are doing the same thing, but when the farmer runs out there to chase them away or even to shoot them or whatever he does, the cranes get away, the geese are stuck behind, and the geese end up paying the price for eating the corn. So then we're asked, well, what's the moral lesson? Okay. Moral lesson that I can think of as I look at this fable, let's look at this from the eyes of the geese, right? The geese are going into this situation thinking that they'd like to go eat some plant. Maybe they see the cranes already eating the plant. They see them down in this one field where there's this special plant growing, and they go down there and they say, well, the cranes are eating it. Maybe we can eat it too. And so they start eating, not realizing that they're about to get into trouble. And then all of a sudden the farmer busts out, and in the flash of an eye, the cranes take off and the geese are stuck behind, and they end up paying the price for it. And you can imagine the geese would probably complain, right? You'd say, well, that's not fair. How come we're getting punished? You know, what about the cranes? They were doing the same thing that we were doing. Why don't they get punished? But this is just how life works sometimes. Sometimes criminals, for example, who do worse things get away with their crimes, and more innocent people who might be committing a crime for the first time are the ones who get caught and punished. And people might ask, you know, why am I the only one getting punished when there were other people doing the same thing? And the answer is because you were caught, you know, tough luck. So a moral of this fable, one moral lesson of this fable, is that we have to be careful not to do things we see other people doing, all right? We have to be careful that we don't do things we see other people doing, because our situation may be different from theirs, okay? The situation that we're in might allow them to do this thing without much fear of punishment, whereas for us, if we do this thing, we don't have the same circumstances they have, and we may end up getting in trouble for it. And that's just how it goes. So it's a good lesson for us not to do things that other people do, or not to imitate things we see other people doing, because our situations may not be the same. I'll give you a good example based on your schoolwork, okay? Let's say there are two kids in school, and there's one kid, and his father is a wealthy man who owns his own business, and his son doesn't do very well in school. He goofs around a lot, is silly at school, doesn't take studies seriously. But he doesn't really care about school because his father is wealthy and he owns a business. And this boy knows that when he's finished with school, he's just going to go work for his father and live happily ever after. So for him, school's not really that important. But this other boy comes from a poor family, and he has no opportunities waiting for him after his school is over. And his success really depends on how hard he works during his school years. But this boy from the poor family looks and sees the other boy always fooling around and having fun at school. He doesn't take studies seriously. So the other boy decides that he's going to start acting like that wealthy boy. And he starts wasting time in school, starts fooling around. And, you know, maybe fooling around and having fun, you know, helps him to get friends, and he becomes popular at school. Maybe he even becomes friends with this other boy. But then all of a sudden, they finish schooling. And at the end of their schooling, the wealthy boy flies off like a crane. He goes and joins his father in business and lives happily ever after. And this other boy graduates from school. He's given his diploma, but then he's got no job opportunities. He's got no financial help from his family because they don't have much money. And the only way that he can really make a successful plan for his life is to bring that diploma and try to find work. He tries to go to college, but he gets denied to college because he didn't do well in school. And so he's stuck. He's stuck paying the penalty for fooling around during his school years. And the other boy gets away and flies off and is safe. So we see how this lesson of the geese and the cranes can teach us, if we think about it, where the geese are like the poor boy in school and the cranes are like the wealthy kid in school. The poor boy is foolish for imitating another boy when he doesn't know the boy's circumstances and doesn't understand the difference, that for one boy, school might not be that big of a deal, but for himself, school actually is very important. So we see this lesson of being careful that we don't just do things we see other people doing, because it may be okay for them to do certain things, and it's not okay for us to do certain things. Some people complain that everybody should be equal, but we see we're not equal, and we've got to be careful. So we've got to think about our own circumstances and what's best for us to do, and not simply look at other people and copy or imitate what they do, because they may already be provided for. They may already have what they need. And it deceives us to think that we can be like them and end up in the same situation, and we can't. Okay, so I would argue that the moral lesson of this fable is to be careful that you don't imitate people who have abilities and opportunities or other circumstances that you don't have. So be careful who you imitate or who you go along with or join. So that would be a good moral lesson that we could draw from this fable. And then how it applies to our life is that we shouldn't look around at other people and think that we can just copy what other people do, because we've got to look at our own lives. We've got to look at our own strengths and weaknesses. We've got to look at our own opportunities and make good decisions based on our own circumstances. Okay, so we've got to be careful not just to follow other people, not to imitate other people, but to look at our lives, figure out what our strengths and weaknesses are, make the most of our opportunities, and make wise choices based on what we actually need to do. All right, so I would argue that that's a good way that we can apply the fable of the geese and the cranes. Okay, real quick in the chat, any other thoughts on this fable? Anything you'd like to share? Any other thoughts you'd like to share on this fable? Any other things come to mind as we read it or talked about it? Just a minute. I'll give you a minute to share any thoughts. If not, we're just going to move on to the next one. You think the geese are the sinners? Well, they're doing the same thing that the cranes are doing, right? But they're the only ones who get punished. Okay, so we can think of other moral lessons too, right? We can think of, for example, we can think of in Christian teaching. In Christian teaching, we can say, well, you know what? This fable shows us that in this life, some people can do bad things and get away with it, and other people will pay the penalty for it. But we also know that at the end of this life, we're all going to stand before God and be judged. And those cranes are going to be made to pay the penalty for what they did. So we can see how it's an example of how life in this world is not fair, right? Some people get punished, other people don't get punished. If two cars are speeding down the highway, let's say two cars are racing down the highway, and there's a cop sitting on the side of the road, and these two cars fly past racing, which car gets pulled over? Do both cars get pulled over and get punished for speeding down the road? No, they don't both get pulled over. The person who gets pulled over is actually going to be the slower car. That's going to be the one the cop catches first. Okay. There's a funny story of, I think it was two men who were in the woods, and suddenly a lion came upon them, and they were asked, do you think you're faster than a lion? And the one man said, I don't need to be faster than a lion. I just need to be faster than you, right? Because the lion's going to get the slower one. So you don't need to be as fast as a lion to get away. You just need to be faster than the slow person. So you see, we can think about these from different angles, from different perspectives. There's a lot more we can think about. You can keep thinking about these fables in all different ways, and they'll just keep giving you more and more ideas. That's why they're so useful. But anyway, that's the fable of the geese and the cranes. That was fable number 96. So if you want to complete that assignment today or sometime this week and submit it, that was fable number 96. Now we're going to go on to 97. It's a little bit longer, but I think it's also a little bit simpler. So let's read the fable of the frogs desiring a king. So this fable is about some frogs. Okay, the frogs, and you know, Aesop likes to talk about frogs quite a bit. And when you see frogs, they're funny creatures. You know, they're sort of strange creatures. They're good for storytelling. Lots of stories about frogs. The frogs were living an easy, free sort of life among the lakes and ponds. So real quick in the chat, it says the frogs were living an easy, free sort of life. Do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing? Do you think Aesop's telling us that the frogs had a good life or a bad life? They were living an easy, free sort of life. A good life or a bad life? Some of you say bad. You think an easy, free sort of life is bad? I don't think your parents would agree that you believe that an easy, free sort of life is bad. I think it's a good life that Aesop's telling us they were enjoying. They were enjoying an easy, free sort of life. They had a peaceful life, living among the lakes and ponds. That's where frogs live. They were comfortable and they had a good life. But they prayed to Jupiter. They prayed to Jupiter, and remember, Aesop lived hundreds of years before Christianity was brought to the world. And when he refers to Jupiter, he's just referring to the god of the gods, the greatest of the gods. He prayed to God to send them a king, or they prayed, sorry. The frogs prayed to God to send them a king. So here they are, living a happy, free life. And for some reason, they pray to the gods, or they pray to God to send them a king. Why do you think they would want a king? If they're living a free and easy sort of life, why do you think that they would want a king? Why would they want a king? They're living a free and easy life in the lakes and the ponds. Why would they want a king? Well, you know, Luke says to rule them, but why would free people want someone to rule them? Do you sit around thinking, boy, I really wish someone would rule over me? I don't think most of us think like that. They want someone to tell them what to do. Josephine says, well, again, I don't think any of you sit around saying, boy, I just wish there was someone who would tell me what to do all the time. Usually we tend to want the opposite, right? We want to be left to make our own decisions. Why do you think that they would want a king? Why would frogs, or why would anyone want a king? What do you think made them pray for a king? They wanted a leader just in case a threat came along. I think that's pretty good. Victor wrote that. Okay. So maybe they, even though they're living a happy life and things are pretty easy, maybe they're thinking, well, it's not always going to be easy. You know, what if some of those big birds show up and try to eat us? Or what if the fish, you know, get bigger and they try to grab us off our lily pads and eat us? Maybe we need someone to, you know, lead us like an army and defend us in battle. So maybe they're worried about the future. Okay. I don't know that they just thought kings seemed cool. Maybe they did, though. Maybe they just thought, you know, hey, it would be cool to have a king, you know? So anyway, that's what we should be asking when we read that, right? When we read that the frogs prayed to Jupiter to send them a king. We should be thinking, why would they do that? Why would they want a king? Okay. Then it says Jove, which is just another name for Jupiter. Okay. So that's just a name for their god. We could just translate that as God if we wanted to. Jove, being at that time in a merry mood, that means silly, okay? He was in a silly mood. In other words, he heard their prayer and thought it was funny and decided to play a little gag on them, right? To joke around with them. So being in a merry mood, he threw them a log. And as he did so, he said, there's a king for you. So he just threw them a log. The log splashed down into the water. And Jupiter said to the frogs, you have this log as a king. The frogs were awed by the splash. So there was this big, great splash, and the frogs were amazed by the splash, and they watched their king in fear and trembling. So they sat there staring at this log, terrified by the big splash that it made. And they watched in fear and trembling. This was the king that Jupiter had given to them, this log. But after a while, it says, encouraged by his stillness, so realizing that he really didn't move, this new king of theirs, this log, one of the frogs, who was more daring than the rest, jumped upon the shoulder of his monarch. Monarch is just another name for king. So they're watching this log, and even though he made a great entrance by splashing down into the lake, after a while, they realized that he wasn't moving and he looked pretty safe. So one of the frogs decided to hop up on the shoulder, or just up on the log, of this king. And you can see how silly this fable is so far, right? Soon, many other frogs followed his example, and they made merry on the back of their unresisting king. So they were playing on their king. And again, you can see that this is ridiculous, right? It's silly on purpose. It's showing how these silly frogs, even though they lived in peace and quiet, asked for a king, and because they desired a king, they were willing to pretend that even a dead log was something important. So here they are, making merry on the back of their unresisting king. What a good king we have, he's so friendly, lets us climb on him, lets us sit on his shoulder and run around on him. What a nice king we have. You see how silly all this is, right? But speedily tiring, so getting tired of this boring, motionless king, getting tired of this king because he was so boring. It says torpid ruler. What do you think the word torpid means? Just based on what we're reading here. Speedily tiring of such a torpid ruler. What do you think torpid means? Dull, boring, still, boring. Good, okay? Now, what you just did there is an important skill. That's called vocabulary in context. So I'm sure that none of you knew what the word torpid meant before you read this fable. I don't even think I did. But you can see that as you read the fable and you come across that word, you can figure out what that word means based on where it is in the story. So that's called understanding vocabulary in context. You don't need to go get a dictionary. You don't need to look it up. You don't need to ask someone. You can figure out what it means, okay? So these frogs, making merry on the back of their king, speedily grew tired of such a torpid ruler. I think all of the things you suggested were good. They again petitioned Jupiter. What does the word petition mean? What do you think the word petition means based on the reading? What do you think petition means? Good, you're all right. Good. Prayed, asked, begged, prayed. Good. Those are all good answers. Okay. Again, that's reading vocabulary in context. We don't need to go look it up. So speedily getting tired with this torpid ruler, they again petitioned Jupiter and asked him to send them something more like a real king, right? Not a log. This log isn't really impressive as a king. We want like a real king, like kings that we see in other places, a real king. And so this time, Jupiter decided to send them a stork. What is a stork? Who knows what a stork is? What's a stork? It's a bird. It's like a crane, a long-legged bird. Okay. Okay, so Jupiter sends them some kind of bird. We'll figure out what kind of bird it is as we keep reading here. Good. Yeah, that's a very good description. A long-legged frog eater. Okay, good. They eat frogs. Good. Big bird that eats fish. Good. All good. So Jupiter sent them a stork. They wanted a king who's more like a real king. So Jupiter sends them a frog-eating bird who tossed them about and gobbled them up without mercy. And so you can see there that if you just would have kept reading, you would have a description that explains what a stork is, right? So you don't need to, roll around on the floor and cry when you see a word you've never seen before in your reading. Just keep reading and you can figure out what it means. This time Jupiter sent them a stork who tossed them about and gobbled them up without mercy. So a merciless ruler, okay, who just devoured them. They lost no time, therefore, in beseeching the god. What does beseeching mean? Another word. What does beseeching mean? Begging, begging. Good, okay? Again, you probably never saw the word beseech, but you can figure out what it means based on the context. Asking, pleading, good. Begging, good. So they lost no time beseeching the god to give them again their former state. So they want to go back to how it was before. They don't like this new king that eats them, right? No, no, replied Jupiter. No, no. A king that did you no harm did not please you. Make the best of the one you have, or you may chance to get a worse in his place. Make the best of the one you have, or you may chance to get a worse in his place. So this fable is pretty easy because Aesop actually tells us the moral lesson of the fable at the end here. The king that did you no harm did not please you. And so you asked for a different one. But notice they didn't ask carefully. They didn't ask for a better one. They just asked for a different one. So they were not content with the simple life that they enjoyed before. They weren't content with the gentle log that Jupiter gave them to be a king. They wanted someone who was more like a king. And so Jupiter said, all right, I'll give you what you want. King that did you no harm, did not please you. And now you'll learn to make the best of the one you have, or you may chance to get a worse in his place. Okay. So that's the fable of the what's the title of it again? The frogs desiring a king. All right. So we've got the fable there. We looked at the details. We saw a couple of vocabulary words that we had to figure out. And then we saw the moral lesson of the fable down in the at the end of that fable. So it's pretty easy to explain the fable, the moral lesson for this fable, because we're told the answer. But what I'd like to talk about a little bit is how this applies to our life, okay? Because this is what's more interesting. Let me ask you a question. Now, I know that most of you are young, so you haven't had a chance to study government or anything like that. And what I want to warn you against, what I want you to be careful not to do. Some of you are writing things for the moral, like make the best of what you have, be content with what you have. Those are general moral lessons, but we've already seen that Aesop has taught those lessons in other fables. When you read a fable, I want you to be careful not to explain it with some general moral lesson that applies to many different fables. Like I could say, the moral of this fable is to be good, right? The moral of this fable is to be good, don't be bad, be nice to people. Well, that's true of every fable, right? That's really not what we want to do. We don't want to give these general moral lessons that are true for every fable. We want to look at the details of the fable and say, what specific moral lesson, what unique moral lesson is Aesop teaching us in this fable. And it's more than just, be content, be thankful, accept whatever your circumstances are. It's more than that. Okay, let's look at the explanation he gives. A king that did you no harm did not please you. Make the best of the king you have, or you may chance to get a worse king in his place. So this fable is really about a king, okay? The moral lesson is a king that did you no harm did not please you. Make the best of the king you have, or you may chance to get a worse king in his place. So I think we need to allow this fable to talk to us about government and thoughts about government, okay? So it's wisdom about government. And this is very important for us because we live in a country that came up with a crazy idea of government that has no king, right? In America, we have no king. So if you want to talk about a crazy idea about government, how about America, where we chose to get rid of a king and live with no king? Some people say, though, that we do have a king in America. Does anybody know? I don't know that you've ever studied government at all, but does anybody know who the early Americans said would be the king in America? Does anybody know who the king of America is? There is a king. Does anybody know who the king is? And don't say President Biden or it's not a president. Does anybody know who the king of America is? There is somebody who rules over America. Now, it's not God. I'm talking about human government. Human government. There is someone or something that rules over America that's different from every other country before us. Very good. Someone said it. Someone got it right. It's not the Pope. No, the Pope does not rule over America, obviously. I think things would be very different if the Pope was in charge of America. Not money. Not money. Yeah, there's the right answer again. The right answer is the Constitution. Okay, what's different about America? What's different about America is that the Americans, when they founded America back in the 1700s, they said, what happens in most countries is that the king makes all the rules and the king controls the whole country, but we're not going to have a country like that. We're not going to have a king who makes the law. We're going to let the law be the king. And so the founders of America wrote the Constitution, and the Constitution was basically taken and put on the throne as the king of America. So it's a very, very wild idea that was never practiced before in history. No, not King George, Anna. King George was thrown off with the revolution. The Constitution was established as the ruler of America. So all of us, we have a ruler in America, and it's the Constitution. The Constitution is the king of America. Okay, so now think about it. The early Americans, when they came to America, there was a king, okay? And, Anna mentioned that it was King George of England. King George was the king, and they chose to get rid of King George. Why did they choose to get rid of King George? Does anybody know why the early Americans didn't want to serve King George? Anybody know? You can share whatever you know about that situation. Why did the Americans not want to serve King George? Because he bossed them around. Margaret asks, what is the Constitution? The Constitution is a document, or I can say the rule that explains how the American people are to be governed. King George was bad, Zoriana says, because he would boss them around. He was a bad king because of taxes, John says. Rebecca says taxes with representatives. He was too far away. They did not like him. He was taxing them more, and he didn't treat them kindly. Those are all good answers. Okay, all of those answers are partly true. The American people didn't believe that King George was actually interested in doing good to them. And so they believed that because you can stop with the chat now. Let me get into this. The Tea Party is not a joke. They actually did throw a whole shipload of tea into the Boston Harbor because the king wanted to collect taxes on it and they didn't want to pay the taxes. That was part of the revolution. But what the problem was the American people asked the question, what is the purpose of government? What is the purpose of government? And they answered the question and said, the purpose of government is to help the people. That's the purpose of government. So if this king is not interested in helping the people, then he doesn't have the right to be in charge of us because we're not his slaves. He's supposed to be serving us. We're not supposed to be serving him. Government is for the people. And so they decided that because King George wasn't doing anything to help the people, that's it for the chat, pay attention. Because King George wasn't helping the people, and because the taxes were unfair and it didn't really seem like he cared about them, he just was trying to get stuff from them and use them for his own benefit. They said, wait, we're not a bunch of slaves here. If the government is not going to help us and do good to us, then we need to make a different government. We need to make a new government. And so they chose to break away from King George. That's called the Revolutionary War. When you study American history, you learn about the Revolutionary War in 1776. So they start a war against the British soldiers who represented King George, and they win the war. And then after they win the war, they've got to decide what kind of government they're going to create. And they say, well, we don't want to create the same problem that we just fought off. We don't want to have another king, because kings always end up being bad, even though kings may be good sometimes. At other times, they're bad. And so it's not worth having a bad king for the benefits of having a good king. So we don't want to take that chance ever again. We want to set up a different kind of government where the people are actually in control of their own government and they get to decide what's good for them and what's not good for them. So we're going to create a government where there is no king who makes the law, but we're going to make a law that the people actually make, and the people make the law and the law governs the people. So it's a different idea about how government should work. So when we look at this fable and we read that the frogs lived with a bad king, and they decided they wished that they could go back to their old way of life. In the beginning, think about the beginning when they were living an easy sort of life. Did the frogs have any king at all? Yes or no? In the beginning, did the frogs have any king? No. Who governed the frogs? Who was in charge of the frogs at the beginning of the fable? Who was in charge of the frogs? Themselves. Very good. Okay, no one was in charge of the frogs. They just sort of governed themselves. They lived at peace in their own place. They were in their natural place. Everything seemed fine. And then they desired a king. And in the end, they learned that the benefits that they thought they might get from a king turned out to bring with them lots of bad things that they didn't have to deal with before. And it wasn't worth, the price of having a king wasn't worth the benefits of having a king. So they wished that they could then go back to their original way of living. But Jupiter said, no, you wanted a king, now you got what you asked for, and you're going to pay the penalty. So it becomes a lesson for other people. So what do you think? Do you think that based on this fable, do you think that the Americans were right for what they did? Do you think that the way that Americans thought about government was right based on this fable? Or do you think it was a bad idea? What do you think? Good idea or bad idea? Don't say yes because I gave you two options. Good idea or a bad idea? Some say good. One says, I don't know. Most of you look like you're saying good. So I think we could say that the frogs really had no reason, or it might look like they had no reason to seek a king. They were living happily as they were in the beginning with no king. Then they asked for a king. Jupiter was actually nice to them, right? He actually was nice to them the first time, and his silly answer when he gave them a log, it was silly, but at the same time, it was nice because he didn't give them what they wanted. He gave them something simple that really didn't change their situation at all. And that was sort of a warning to them, but they still continued asking for a real king. And so Jupiter finally said, all right, you asked for it. And so he gave them a king. And again, in order to be a king, he would have to be more powerful than them, right? Otherwise, there's no use having a king if he's not powerful. So Jupiter said, all right, I'll give you a big, powerful king so you can be like other people. And he gave them a stork. And of course, the stork chose to use that strength to turn around and gobble up the frogs, which is the danger that government presents to us, right? There's always the danger that the government can get power and then use it against us. And that leads to all kinds of different problems. So we could say that maybe the Americans had a good idea by trying to build a country that didn't have a king and that just left power to the people to control things. Now, the American government is very complicated. It's not like it's simple. We don't vote on everything. We choose people to go and represent us, and it's very complicated. There's lots of laws and rules for how our government works. But when you really look at our country in America, the people are ultimately in control. We get to choose who the president is. And if we don't think the president is doing a good job in 4 years, we get to choose another president. We get to choose who the lawmakers are. And if we don't think the lawmakers are doing a good job, we can replace them and choose different lawmakers. Presidents appoint the Supreme Court judges. And if we don't like the judges, we can warn the president that if he doesn't choose better judges, we're going to get somebody else to be president who will choose judges that we want. So even though it takes time, the people don't just change things overnight. It takes time, but the people ultimately control everything in America. And it gives us an interesting subject to study, which hopefully you'll go on to study one day in American government. We have an American government course in the academy that you can study. I hope you do study that book. It's a good one. And we'll be able to discuss these things when you learn all the details. So anyway, the moral lesson of this fable is to be careful when you think about government and things like that. Be careful that you don't desire, and this kind of relates to the fable we just read about the cranes and the geese. Be careful that you don't look at other countries and simply want to copy them or be like them, because you may not know all the details about their circumstances. It may look good on the outside, but you might not think about all of the details of what it's like to actually live with a king. You might find out that it's very bad. You might think, well, it'd be fun, right? If we had a good king, wouldn't that be awesome? If we had a king like King St. Louis of France, who was a saint, wouldn't it be cool if we lived in a country where there was a king and the king was a saint? That would be cool, right? But at the same time, King Louis dies and all of a sudden there's a new king and he's not a saint. And so that's the danger with having kings, is that a good king can be the best kind of government, but a bad king could be the worst kind of government. So it's a hard question to answer. But just because another country, another people may look like they're having a good time with a king, you might not know all the details of what it's like to live in that country. And so we need to be careful. And if you're already enjoying all of the good things of life, if you're already living in peace, if you're already living in you've got a comfortable home, you've got everything that you need provided for you, you're at peace with your neighbors, why would you want to change that? Why would you want to seek something else? Unless you're just being covetous and desiring more and more and more, and eventually covetousness is going to get you into trouble. Okay. So the moral of this fable is, when you think about government, be careful that you're not covetous, because you might already have the best things and seeking more might bring trouble with it. Now, in the Bible, we have a good story that teaches this same message. When think about this, those of you who study the Bible or those of you who study chronology, answer these questions for me. Ready? When God brought Israel out of Egypt, right? They were slaves in Egypt and God set them free. When he brought them out of Egypt, who was put in charge of the Israelite people? Who was put in charge of the Hebrews? Did they have a king? Who was put in charge? You're all wrong. Moses was not in charge. Moses was not in charge. Who was in charge of the people? Who was in charge of the Israelites? I'll give you a hint. It was a lot like America. Who was in charge of the Israelites? Not judges. Nope. The 10 Commandments, the law, good. Okay, so the ruler of the Hebrew people was God's law. That was the law. Now everybody was subject. Moses was subject to that law. All of the judges were subject to that law. All of the strong men in Israel were subject to that law. The law was the ruler of the Hebrew people. And so Moses was given the law. Moses didn't tell them the law. Moses didn't make the law. Moses was not the king. God gave them the law, and the law was their king. I mean, God was their king, but they were ruled by the law, even Moses, everybody. After a while, they started to interact with all of these other people. Let me ask you this. What did God promise that he would do for the Hebrew people when he brought them out of Egypt? What did he promise them? What did God promise the Hebrews? He would give them a nice land. That's good. That's right. He would give them land. Good. What kind of land? A desert? A mountain? What kind of land would he give them? Would he give them the Grand Canyon? Just some big empty desert land? A land flowing with, I think you meant to write milk and honey, right? Not a desert. He didn't give them a desert. That wouldn't be much of a gift. Hey, here's a nice desert, right? A land flowing with milk and honey, good. Okay, a rich land that was very comfortable, that was supplied with all kinds of good things. He promised that he would give them a land flowing with milk and honey. Very good. Okay. What did they need to do? What did they need to do to get that land? What did they need to do to get that land? What did they need to do? Margaret says, obey him. Zoe says, follow the 10 commandments. Rebecca says, obey him. Be good. Follow his commandments. Very good. All that they needed to do was obey his commandments. He promised to give them the land. He promised to give them everything they needed. Did they need a king? Did they need a king? No. Very good. I see Adeline, I think it is, shaking her head. No, that's good. They didn't need a king, right? And not only that, but they actually went in and God destroyed other nations that were in their way who had kings. So the other nations had kings and God destroyed those nations, and the Hebrew people actually took over their land because God gave it to them. So they had no need of a king. But later on, all of a sudden, the Hebrew people say to God, just like the frogs do in this fable, they say, we want a king so that we can be like other nations. That's what they actually say to God. We want a king. Give us a king like the other nations have. Now think of how dumb it was. They watched other nations with kings lose everything. And yet they thought that having a king was impressive. They thought it looked cool to have a king, and they asked for a king. And God warned them, just as Jupiter does in the fable here. God warned them, if you have a king, he's not going to be good. You may think it's going to be good, but he's going to rule over you, take all of your possessions for his own. It's not what you think it is, but they insisted and they said, no, we want a king anyway. So God gave them a king. Who knows the name of the king that God gave to the Hebrews? Who was their king? Anybody know that story? Who was the king? Very good, Josephine. Saul. Good, Rebecca. Okay, so King Saul. Does anybody know how King Saul was described in the Bible? When he's introduced, he's described. Does anybody know the story, how he's described, what kind of man he was? Handsome, very good. He was handsome. What else? No, it doesn't say he was evil. When he's first introduced, good, Rebecca, it says he was tall. Says his head was a full head higher than all other men. He was a big, tall, handsome man, just the perfect kind of man that everybody wants for a king, right? The biggest, tallest, handsomest, strongest man. Now that, if we could just get a king like that, then we'll be successful, right? Then we'll be cool, okay? But it turns out that Saul has a problem. Does anybody know what Saul eventually does? What ends up happening to Saul? Who knows what happens to Saul? Yeah, you can say he turned bad. That's good. Does anybody know what really happened to him? He went crazy. That's definitely true. He murdered. That's true. To put it simpler, he disobeyed. He disobeyed God's commandments. That's what happened. Okay. He disobeyed. He trusted in his own judgment, decided to do something that God told him not to do. Now, there were no Christians then, so he couldn't kill any Christians. This was like 1,000 years before Christ. He didn't kill any Christians. But he trusted in his own judgment, chose to disobey God. And so God took the kingdom away from him and gave it to somebody else. Who did God give the kingdom to after he took it away from Saul? Does anybody know? Now, Victor says he became Paul, and that's pretty funny because that's a different Saul, Victor. You're thinking of Saul in the New Testament books. That's a different person. And you've all got this right. David is the one that God makes king in Saul's place. Okay, so we could get into that story, and it's one of my favorite stories, but we're out of time here. So anyway, we see this story of being warned by God to watch out for this desire for a king in the story of King Saul. The Hebrews ask for a king. God warns them and says, you really don't want a king. I'm warning you. My way is better. But they say, no, give us a king. And so finally God says, all right, I'll give you a king, a big, tall, handsome one. And within a few years, he turns out to be a bad man, and the Hebrews wish they never had a king. But fortunately, God raised up David, who was a good king, who helped the Israelites. And that's the story of how Israel got a king. So anyway, there's a lot we could talk about, obviously, but hopefully you understand this fable of the frogs desiring a king. We could ask the question, why did God choose frogs? Probably because frogs don't feel safe. They're a prey animal. They eat bugs and things like that, but a lot of the bigger animals, big fish eat frogs, bigger birds eat frogs, and so on. So they probably feel, even though they may be free and happy on the lake, they might still feel a little unsafe. And so they might want protection. And maybe that's what ultimately makes people want a king, is they just don't feel safe. So anyway, I think that the fable of the frogs desiring a king is simple enough. So that's all I wanted to share today. I wanted to get through those 2 fables. Hopefully that's helpful. I hope that you turn around now and go finish those assignments and get them turned in while the fables are fresh in your mind and you've got all of those ideas ready to go to add them to your assignment. Hopefully you'll do that. That's not considered copying or anything like that. I'm explaining them to you, and you're proving that you paid attention and you came to the class and learned it. So that's a good thing. If you have any questions, I'll hang out with you. If there's anything you'd like to talk about, if you don't have any questions and want to get going, you're free to go now, because I'm not going to get into anything new, but I will answer any questions anybody has. At first, if you have questions about Aesop's fables, I'd like to take them first, but then if those questions die down, if you've just got any questions about your studies, we can chat a bit, and I'm happy to help you out. Okay, so for those of you who are leaving, thanks for coming. I look forward to seeing you next time. And for the rest of you, feel free to post any questions you've got in the chat. All right, thank you guys. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen here. All right, so any questions anybody's got, you can fire away and I'll answer whatever questions come in. Yes, Victor, there's two different Sauls. There's a Saul in the Old Testament history who lived around 1000 BC, and there's a different Saul in the New Testament who lived at the time of Jesus, or just after the time of Jesus. Two different Sauls. So be careful with your Bible names. That's why in our scripture study classes, we want to make sure we know who all the characters are so we don't get confused like that. Okay. Any questions about Aesop's Fables? Any questions about your studies in general? Anything that you need help with? You can use this time while we're on here together to ask any questions you have. If not, you're free to get back to work and get some assignments done. Is Saul really bad? Well, the Saul in the Old Testament was bad because he kind of went crazy, and God took away the kingdom from him, and he tried to hold on to it by trying to kill David. So he turned out to be bad. Why didn't the frogs choose a frog to be their king? That's a good question. I think that to the frogs that wouldn't make much sense. Like we're already weak. We want somebody who's stronger than us. Why would we choose one of us? He's not going to help us. He's just going to get chewed up himself. So maybe we need somebody else to be our king. For example, a good example of that would be poor people wanting a rich person to be their king, right? They're not going to choose another poor person to be their king. Usually the poor people want some rich, powerful person to be their king. They think that the rich person would help them to do things they can't do. So the frogs aren't going to choose one of their equals to be their king. Why did the Jews have to do animal sacrifices? Well, they had to pay for their sins, right? If you commit a sin, you owe God payment for that sin because you did something wrong. You've got to, in some way, pay God back for the wrong that you did. And even though God already planned to help us take care of that when he sends Jesus into the world to suffer for us, the Jews had to give something. And so God accepted animal sacrifices for the time until Jesus would come. Now that Jesus came, there's no more animal sacrifices. That's all over and gone. So that was just a temporary thing that God did to accept payment from people for their sins until Jesus came. And Jesus offered himself as the payment for our sins. Victor's answer was good because Christ wasn't crucified yet. That's right. Okay, well, Josephine, you're talking about something called a scapegoat. Yeah, that's something else. Again, if you get into sacred scripture studies in the future when you get older, you're going to read through all of those stories and get into all those details. Okay, any other questions? Any other questions? Everyone's studies going okay? Are your studies going well for you? Feel like you understand what you're doing and how things work? If you have any questions, just know in the future, if you have any questions, you can bring them to these meetings, and after I'm done with the lesson, we can talk about anything that you'd like to talk about. The next fable, Josephine, we're just going to keep going here. So the next fable in the book, there you've got a picture of the stork and the frogs. The next fable is two rabbits. So we'll get into that one next week. Okay, the fable of the two rabbits. Any other questions? Any other questions? Now, listen, if you don't have any questions now, I'm still available all the time. If you have a question, you can go on live chat or send an email. Let me know if you have any questions. But like I said, if you do have anything you'd like to talk about, bring it to these meetings and we can chat after the lesson's over. All right. I don't see any more questions coming in. So I'm going to wrap up here. Thanks for coming. I hope that was helpful. Go get those assignments done, right? Go get those Aesop's Fables assignments done and turned in, because you have all of this information in your head. So go get those assignments done, get your credit for the lesson. You're loving the program the most you've ever understood. Well, I hope that that's true. And if there's other classes that you all would like to have, you just need to let me know, because we can have more live classes. They're easy for me, and I actually like meeting with you all. So let me know if there's anything else you'd like to study, and we can study some more. All right, but that's all for today. Tomorrow we'll do Latin studies, and Thursday we'll do Greek studies. So if you're going to be around for Latin studies, I'll see you tomorrow. And if not, I'll see you next week for more Aesop's Fables. All right, God bless everybody.